and welcome to another 10-Minute Monday. We are in week 3 of Threshold. If you have not watched week 1 and 2, I highly recommend you go and do that first. I will have all the links in the description box below. This week we are talking about Jacob and wrestling with God. But before we get to that, we need to know a little bit more about Jacob up to this point. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of Jacob's life. Jacob was the son of Isaac and Rebekah and the grandson of Abraham, whom God had promised to make a father of nations. Jacob was a twin brother to Esau. Esau was the firstborn, and Jacob literally grabbed his heel on the way out. So Jacob, his name means supplanter, or to grab another's heel. Literally speaking, it means to take what belongs to someone else. God even told Rebekah that her older son would serve her younger son. When Jacob and Esau were grown, Jacob tricks his brother into giving him his birthright for a meal. Esau is so hungry that he gives Jacob his birthright. And then Rebekah convinces Jacob to trick his father, Isaac, into giving Jacob Esau's blessing. So this makes Esau, rightfully so, a little angry, and he wants to kill his younger son, Jacob. And so Jacob flees. And on his way out of town, he camps somewhere and he has this vision of angels and a ladder up to heaven. And that's a whole nother lesson that we'll get into some other time, but not today. After this, Jacob reaches Haran, which is the land of his mom. So this is his mother's brother, is who he's going to meet. And this is Uncle Laban, okay? So Jacob is in love, he falls in love with the younger daughter, Rachel. But he kind of meets his match in Uncle Laban, and he gets tricked into marrying the older daughter, Leah. So Jacob works for more years and earns the right to marry Rachel as well. So he finally gets to marry his love, and he works many years for Laban. But in that amount of time, through God's protection and Jacob's intelligence, Jacob is able to take much of Laban's herd. He gets kind of rich because he's able to trick him into taking some goats and some livestock. So finally, God tells Jacob that he wants him to go back to his homeland. And so Jacob is on this journey back home. And the problem is that he thinks that probably Esau's probably still pretty mad with him. So as he approaches home, Jacob sends messengers to Esau. And they return and tell him that Esau is now approaching with 400 men. So things don't look good for Jacob. And we find Jacob here, and he prays and he says, "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have 2 camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I'm afraid he will come and attack me and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted." Jacob has spent his whole life fighting. His brother, his dad, his father-in-law, he's continually tried to find his own way in this world. He finds his own way by getting the firstborn birthright and getting the blessing from his father, to get the wife he desires, and to get the livestock, making him rich. He fights and he claws his way through life. Until now. And now he prays to God, the God of his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham, who have both been promised nations. He's remembering the promises that God made to his father and to his grandfather and to himself. He is following God's lead and coming back to his homeland. And so therefore he's submitting his life to God. He says, I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness that you've shown your servant. After this prayer, He strategically divides his people and his possessions. He sends some of them along ahead as gifts for his brother, trying to calm down that anger, for stealing his birthright and his blessing. He's trying to calm down his older brother. He's still scheming and plotting his own way through. So he sends some ahead as gifts, and then the rest of his family and possessions, he sends them across the Jabbok River. And he stays behind and prays. And this is where we find Jacob in this moment. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. But then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." See, Jacob at this point knows that he's dealing with the supernatural because his hip has been thrown out of socket. And so he knows that this is not just a mere mortal man. This man that he thought he was wrestling with, touched his hip, and his hip is now damaged. And so he asks for this supernatural being's blessing. This was a normal thing in their culture. Whenever they would come home or whenever they were crossing borders, they would ask for the blessing of the gods. And so it continues, and the man asks him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answers. And he's being honest about who he is in this moment. Then the man says, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But the man replies and says, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blesses him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him, and he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Jacob's struggle, his wrestling match with God, was not just physical, but spiritual, like we said. He finds his victory in persistence, asking after a blessing, for he knows that this is not just a man he wrestles, as his hip is supernaturally wounded. He finds victory in his prayers and submission. Jacob is forever changed through this experience with God. He gets a new name, a new meaning, a new promise from God. He goes from being a trickster, one who has to grab things that don't belong to him, and he becomes one who wrestles with God, or someone who is triumphant with God. We learn after his prayers and his wrestle with God that Esau had forgiven him. Esau forgave his brother before Jacob sent the gifts. Jacob didn't need to scheme and plot and plan to get the outcome that he wanted. It was his prayer, his change of heart, that made the difference. After this, we see an interesting thing where Israel sets up an altar. And he, for the first time ever, says he set up an altar there and called it God, the God of Israel. This is a change for him. Every time before, whenever he's prayed, whenever he's talked about God, he's talked about the God of Isaac, my father, the God of Abraham, my grandfather, the God who promised them nations, the God I've seen faithfully work in their lives. But now Jacob became Israel by wrestling with God. We have the ability to walk across that threshold of change, to be forever changed by coming to the Lord and saying, "I will wait for you. I want your blessing in this. I don't want to do what I'm doing the way that I'm doing it anymore. I want to be a new person found in you, and I want my relationship to be defined by you." We see that Israel from this moment forward walks faithfully with the Lord. At the end of his life, he says, "We are now going to Bethel, where I will build an altar to the God who answered my prayers when I was in distress. He has been with me wherever I have gone." God is with you wherever you go. He hears your calls in distress. He wants to make you into a new creation. He wants you to be forever changed by a radical encounter with him. Thank you for joining us for this 10-Minute Monday. Hope you'll come back next week. Until then, thanks. Bye.